Okay, I'm going to test it out by putting on the video.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Looks like okay. Let's see. Okay. So it looks like we're at least live streaming on YouTube for sure. Let me just check Facebook. Maybe. If we're having trouble with Facebook, I'm going to. Yeah, we might be having trouble with with the Facebook. Unless it just connected. Let's see. Yeah, I'm not sure what's going on with Facebook. I can direct people to YouTube though. I'm going to start admitting some people. I did a couple times. So I'm just directing people to YouTube. Yeah, okay. I almost spelled Facebook face boom. Okay, thank you. You're the best. Hi, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Yeah. Okay. My name's Eileen. I'm one of the Thomas Crane librarians, and I'm here in the building. Here to welcome Jane O'Neill. She's with Culturally Curious, and she's here. Who's going to be talking about Norman Rockwell and his views on exclusion and race. So Jane, I'm going to go ahead and let you get started.
All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name's Jane O'Neill, and just to give you a little background on myself, my educational background is in art history and in arts education. I have a master's in both. And I've worked at a number of museums over the years, and I've taught art history and museum education at the college level for many years. And about 3 years ago, I launched Culturally Curious, which is an opportunity for me to kind of curate my own programs and put together images that I think are really interesting and tell the stories that I think are most compelling when it comes to looking at art and talking about art. So that's what we're going to be doing together tonight, and hopefully it will be fun and uplifting and engaging. I have a lot of images, so we're going to be moving pretty quickly through this. So that being said, once I get going, I'm not always the best about checking the chat box during the middle of the program, but there are a couple of places where I can pause and we can just sort of check in with people if they have any burning questions. And then of course, at the end, anything that anybody wants to follow up on, questions or comments, I'm very open and receptive to that. So our talk tonight is Norman Rockwell, Inclusion, Exclusion, and Evolving Views on Race. I put this program together actually at the end of last year, and it has created the opportunity for a lot of great conversations about what is happening in our country today. And Norman Rockwell has a way of sort of softening the hard edges of those conversations, and I think he sort of welcomes people into the conversation. He eases them in a wonderful way. So this incredible image that I have on the screen right now, his painting called The Problem We All Live With, is something that we'll look at a little bit more in depth as we get into the program. But I wanted to start off just by introducing Norman Rockwell. I have a feeling that everybody who's online with us tonight probably knows who he is, but I just want to make sure that we're all starting off from the same starting point. So Norman Rockwell, we've got his dates up here. He was born at the end of the 19th century. He died at the age of 84. He is generally known as America's most beloved illustrator, and he liked that term, illustrator. He was a painter, but he didn't necessarily consider himself to be a fine artist, a fine art artist, I should say. And I love this photo of him because it shows that he had some humor, some wit to him. He was a great storyteller. His work really sort of reflected and helped to define American culture in so many ways, particularly in the 1940s and 50s. And his paintings have this ability to speak to kind of universal experiences and feelings. And that's really what the first half of this program is about. He had formal training as a painter, and then he had a nearly 5-decade-long career with the Saturday Evening Post. He painted more than 320 covers for them. Sometimes in one year, he would paint up to 9 covers in one year. So he could work fast and he was prolific. He has, I think he produced more than 4,000 oil paintings during his lifetime, 4,000 works of art, I should say. He is very strongly associated with patriotic themes. He supported the war effort in World War II. He worked with the Boy Scouts for many years. He painted presidential portraits. So he's really tied up in the identity of America. And just before he passed, he did receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So he's this American icon in so many ways. So let's dive in to what some of his paintings look like. I love to start with this image. And in a perfect world, we would all have a chance to sort of weigh in with what we think is going on here, because I think that this is one of his most rewarding images to talk about. I wanted to start with this image because this is an image about justice. You can probably see right along the top right here, we have the words jury room painted backwards. So we are inside a jury room here, and we see essentially the story of like 12 angry men playing out here. But in this case, our holdout is a young woman. And so this isn't just a painting about justice. This is Norman Rockwell creating a painting about social justice as well. Because when he painted this in 1959, women across the country were still not allowed to serve on juries. So he's really making a comment here about the impact that women could have if they were sort of granted kind of equal rights as men. And of course, this young woman here, I mean, I just love the steadfastness that's communicated by her pose here with arms crossed. She is kind of standing her ground here, and despite keeping this jury for what you can presume is a very long time with all the smoke in the air and all the crumpled ballots on the floor, you can tell that she is not going to waver anytime soon. And of course, Norman Rockwell painted himself into this picture, sort of hanging over this girl's head. There's all these sorts of interesting poses and gestures to intimidate and coerce here, but they don't seem to be working. So thinking about social justice, let's just do a quick overview in terms of what we'll be covering tonight, because this is about an hour-long program. As I said, we'll be going through it pretty quickly. So we're going to talk a little bit about how Norman Rockwell deals with or creates this idea of everybody feeling like they're included in the American dream. How does he do that in his works of art? And then on the opposite side of that coin, how does he effectively show feelings of loneliness and isolation? We think of him as, you know, a humorist in so many ways, but there are a lot of images that he created that sort of tap into almost shameful, unspoken feelings of loneliness. And then we'll pivot from there and think about how his ability to do both of those things translated to how he dealt with issues of race, particularly on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And then we'll sort of track how his feelings and his work evolved over the course of his career. So a lot to cover. So let's dive right in. So thinking about feeling included in the American dream, how does Norman Rockwell do this? I have just a few images to share with you, and some of them are probably very familiar. So this first one here, this was a cover for the Saturday Evening Post back in 1947, and it's called Going and Coming. So it's sort of a split screen here, horizontally down the middle, across the middle, I should say. And of course, on top, they are going. We've got this large nuclear family plus grandma and the dog. They're headed to the beach. They've got the rowboat strapped to the top of the car. They're filled with excitement and anticipation. And then coming is the bottom part as they're coming home, and you can see that they've all just been worn out from their day of fun. All of the kids look exhausted, even the little girl who's blowing the bubble up top, the bubble's now deflated. and dad's hunched over. His cigar is much shorter. The mom here has fallen asleep. And then, of course, the little joke that Norman Rockwell puts in here is that grandma, who's sitting in the back in both pictures, is the only one who's unchanged. She's the only one who survived this without kind of wilting or getting tired. So there's supposed to be an element here that we all connect with, this idea of the dynamics of family, the excitement of going on a trip together, the luxuries of middle class, that you can go on a little trip, a day trip like this, and spend all this time together and have those kind of inside jokes about, somebody stinking up the car up on top here, or somebody like grandma, who maybe doesn't participate that much, but she is steadfast throughout the entire experience. Another image like this one here is a great example of how Norman Rockwell could create an image that most anyone could connect to. This is called Easter Morning. It was painted in 1959. And even though there's a reference to a religious holiday here, there is something about this picture, this idea of a family member who's trying to get out of an obligation, trying to stay home, needs a lazy day. Whether it's your father or a sibling or your mother, we've all experienced this in some way. So we have the mother in the background with her two daughters and son sort of marching off to church dutifully, all dressed up and ready to go. And dad is sort of slinking down in the chair in the foreground, surrounded by the debris of all of these newspapers. And of course, he's pretending as though he can't be seen, but everybody knows that he's there. Even his cigarette smoke is sort of wafting up ahead of him. And his little son looks over at him with this expression that really sort of says, "I wish I could stay here with you, Dad." So family dynamics and the humor of them, even though when you're experiencing them, they can be stressful or frustrating. These are things that Norman Rockwell depicted so well. And of course, he is so well known for creating images like the one that we see here. This was the last Christmas cover that he created for the Saturday Evening Post. This is 1948. And when you look at this picture, there aren't too many references, again, to the religious holiday. We see just a little snippet of a Christmas tree up in the top right-hand corner. We see the central figure here with some wrapped packages under his arm. What this picture is all about is a homecoming. It's about a reunion. We see a young man who has either been away at college, or maybe he's gone off to work in the big city, and he's just returned to his family. And we see just the overjoyed expressions of his entire family as he kind of re-enters his childhood home. He's embraced by his mother. Everybody's just thrilled and overjoyed to see him, all different generations. And then, of course, the little humorous element that I think everybody can connect with again is that this young man has brought home a very full piece of luggage that presumably is filled with dirty laundry for his mother to do. We've all experienced that in some way, right? The last image that I wanted to show you that connects to this idea of the American dream and how Norman Rockwell could create a scene that makes us feel like we're all a part of it is this one here. I think most people think of this as like a classic Thanksgiving image or maybe even a Christmas image, but this is a picture called The Freedom from Want. He painted it in 1943. We're going to look a little bit more at this picture a little later on. But what we see here is a very happy multi-generational family. They are about to kind of break bread together, have a meal together, but you'll notice nobody's looking at the food. They're happy to see each other. And they're sitting at this big long table. And it's, again, it's all of the trappings of middle-class life. And this is 1943, fresh off of the Depression. Rockwell does this wonderful thing where he has this figure in the lower right corner who's looking out at us, the viewer. He's extending the table to us so that we all feel like we're sitting at this table and partaking in the joy of spending time with family and the joy of breaking bread together. So there's all these great ways, humorous ways, semi-sentimental ways that Norman Rockwell is connecting us with the American dream here. Now let's look at the other side of the coin. How does he create images that connect with our idea or our sort of intuitive sense of loneliness or isolation? He does this very effectively throughout his entire career. This is an early picture. It's from 1937, and it's just called The Ticket Agent. And of course, what we're looking at here is an older gentleman who has the simple job of selling tickets to people who are going off on trips. And here he is stuck in this little booth behind bars, almost like a prisoner. And he's surrounded by all of these posters for, exotic destinations, and even the simple poster of "Are you bored? Travel." And here he is just stuck there all by himself. He longs for adventure. He longs for a life that's different than what he wants, we can all assume. But here he is stuck in this place. And I think everyone on some level has had either a job that makes them feel this way or has felt the desire for an adventure or the desire to escape that is depicted here in such an effective way. Another way that Norman Rockwell can make you or can communicate this idea of loneliness and isolation is showing someone who feels alone in the crowd. And look at how well he does this with colors here. The picture that we're looking at is called Skiers on a Train, 1962. You can just imagine all these people are heading up to Vermont to have the ski vacation of their dreams. They're filled with energy and excitement. They're making friends with other skiers. They're all dressed in these festive reds. And then this figure at the center of it, who's dressed in these kind of, dark, cool colors. There's no enthusiasm there. He's not traveling in order to ski. He probably doesn't know how to ski, and he feels like a stranger in a strange land. And that's an experience that we've all had, probably not on a train, probably not related to skiing, but we've all felt like the person who doesn't belong in sort of a festive setting like this. And this is just probably another way to express the same idea. This is such a poignant scene for so many people that I talk to. This is from 1964. And it was a cover that Rockwell painted for the magazine McCall's. It's just generally known as Girl Looking Downstairs at a Christmas Party. And so we have this young child who we see from behind, which makes us, the viewer, sort of adopt her perspective and immediately identify with her. And we know it's a Christmas party. We see some wreaths and holly just sort of decorating the house. But the focus here is on all of these adult faces and then all of these adult conversations that are happening downstairs. And it might as well be a world away. It's that feeling of being on the outside of something, wanting to be on the inside of something, but just feeling so separate. And Norman Rockwell has a great way of expressing the childhood desire to just be older, to be ready for the next step. And I think there's a little bit of that here. So one last scene that sort of taps into loneliness, and that is 1953's The Soda Jerk. It was Norman Rockwell's son who actually posed as the soda jerk here. And you can see he is flirting up a storm with these three girls who are dressed in primary colors. And I think it's the girl in blue that is really getting the intense eye contact that's happening here. We can see that our soda jerk is neglecting his duties on the counter, but that counter line also brings us all the way back to this figure in the upper left, who's another teenage boy who's sitting by himself. You can see his eyebrows are sort of pointing upwards as though he's sort of looking concerned. And he's just watching this whole interaction unfold next to him. And you can just imagine that he's thinking something along the lines of, why not me? What's this guy have that I don't have? And I'm sure it takes almost all of us back to, those feelings of being younger and again, sort of being on the outside, looking into the kind of social interactions you wish you could have had. So with all that being said, we have to think about how this reflects on Norman Rockwell and his career at the Saturday Evening Post, and particularly as it relates to race. So we have this idea of Norman Rockwell working at the Saturday Evening Post. Uh, at its peak in the 1950s and 60s, the Saturday Evening Post had a circulation of upwards of 6 million subscribers. And so the images on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post were they were a part of American culture. If you didn't see it at the newsstand, it was sitting on your dining room table or your coffee table for an entire week. And so I think it's really, you can't really overemphasize the power of these images. And the images that I have up here on the screen right now from 1941, I think hits an important note, and that is so many of these images were sort of aspirational. We've got a young girl here in like dirty saddle shoes and a school sweater, but she's holding up her cover of the Saturday Evening Post with kind of like a starlet on it, and she looks so much older because of that. So with these images having such a powerful role in American society, particularly in the 40s, 50s, and 60s, let's think about the fact that they are essentially devoid of a real examination of race. And why is that? Because Norman Rockwell was so good at effectively communicating the pain of being on the outside of a social interaction of society even. So he was kind of the perfect artist to communicate what was happening in terms of race in America. I do want to emphasize that other magazines were not afraid to examine the issue of race, straightforward to put African Americans and Black people on their covers. So we have Time and Life and Newsweek here that are addressing social issues in a straightforward way. So what made the Saturday Evening Post different? And why wasn't Norman Rockwell using his capabilities in terms of storytelling to tell the story of race in America? Well, this is our simple explanation right here. This is a quote from Norman Rockwell. George Horace Lorimore, the Saturday Evening Post editor, who was a very liberal man, told me never to show colored people except as servants. So there was a really strict rule, a very strict rule at the Saturday Evening Post about the content of their covers. And this very much limited the way Norman Rockwell could compose an image and the kinds of stories he could tell. So I wanted to show you how this rule translates to other covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And I have just a few of them to share with you. And they're not images created by Norman Rockwell, but I wanted to show you what race did look like when it was featured on the cover. So this is sort of an earlier picture. This is 1930. And it's just a depiction of two white men dressed in blackface performing as minstrels. Their bodies are a little bit cartoonish here. This is supposed to be a silly picture, but of course, in today's society, we know and we look at an image like this as being inherently racist. Other images, like the one that we have here from 1934, it's called The End of Vacation, they reinforce kind of the social hierarchy that already existed in America. So we have this beautiful, slender woman who, again, sort of looks like a starlet, who is leaving her vacation. She's as light as air, you know, she's holding a bouquet of flowers, waving to whoever she's leaving behind. And then from our perspective, behind her is a Black man who is carrying all of her heavy luggage. And every time I try to count how many pieces he's carrying, I'm always sort of astonished by how burdened he is with her possessions. And so there's literally this wedge between these two people that that really shows a real disparity in terms of the way people were living in the 1930s in America. This is by the same artist. His name is J.C. Leyendecker, and he was actually really a mentor to Norman Rockwell, and his ability to tell a story on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, I think, was really influential to Rockwell. This was a 4th of July cover from 1937. We've got two little boys who climbed a lamppost in order to kind of see and celebrate a 4th of July parade that's happening underneath them. And you can see that these two boys have very different places on this lamppost, and you can also tell that there's a real big difference in terms of class. So the white boy sits sort of triumphantly at the top of this lamppost. You can tell he probably comes from like a middle class or an upper middle class background, and he's saluting presumably the soldiers who are down below. And the black boy is hanging on for dear life. He's looking cautiously below. He's wearing, torn clothing, and it sort of speaks to just the struggle of being Black in America at that time, particularly from our modern day perspective. But for the time, it just reinforced again these different sort of social stratus placements that existed. So the next few images are a little bit repetitive, but I just wanted to show you that that when Black people did grace the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, it was in very it reinforced stereotypes that already existed. So again, this is J.C. Leyendecker. These are two images from the 1930s, and it's essentially the Black mammy type. It's always an overweight Black woman with a handkerchief on her head and an apron. And in some cases, you can tell that she's working in service of a white family. In some cases, she's working at home, but it tends to be the same note again and again. And I want to emphasize to you how limiting that is for people if they're only represented in one narrow way in mass culture. And that is exactly what was happening with the Saturday Evening Post. Occasionally, they would poke fun at white people, white women, and show them in a similar way with the gingham top and the scarf and the hair. In this case, it's a woman who's about to do her spring cleaning, and she's standing up on this pedestal with the joke down here saying she's the Queen of the May. And we're supposed to laugh at her because typically when white middle-class women were depicted on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post, even if they were in comical situations like the woman on the right, she still looks like a fashion plate. She looks like Donna Reed. She's slender, she's beautiful, her hair is styled, she's still got beautiful clothes on. So there was a real disparity in the way that Blacks and whites were shown. And so just one last slide that really reinforces that. Again, these are not Norman Rockwell images, but you can see from one cover to the next, these span almost a decade here, 1936 on the left and 1941 on the right. We see just the same clothes, the same body type, and the same work engaged in by this mammy type that continued to be represented for quite some time on the covers of the Saturday Evening Post. And that, of course, was reflected in other parts of culture. You have Hattie McDaniel, who was the first African-American Oscar winner, but she played the role of a slave in Gone with the Wind. And then even present day America, we have movies and books like The Help, particularly the movie that sort of became problematic in that you have some of the best African-American actresses who were working roles in this movie. And we see over here on the right, said she really regretted playing this role after the fact because it was not the voices of the maids that were heard. So these stereotypes have a very, very powerful and long-lasting effect. So how does this all relate to Norman Rockwell? Maybe this is a good point to pause just for a moment. And if anybody has any burning questions or comments at this point that they'd like to weigh in on or weigh in with, please feel free to do so if you want to unmute yourself. Or Eileen, has there been anything in the chats that has been particularly?
Not as of yet, no.
Okay, all right, then we will keep going. Let me just take a quick sip here. So we're going to take a quick look at how race did factor in with Norman Rockwell's early work. And this is the first image that I could find where he painted an African American. And this dates to 1929, I believe. So it's a really early painting for him. And this actually wasn't a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. This was an advertisement, believe it or not, for floor varnish. So what we see here is what we can imagine is an itinerant musician who has been welcomed into this house. You can see that they've rolled up the rug here, revealing this beautifully varnished floor. And as he's playing the banjo, this young boy, who we can imagine is sort of a privileged young boy, he's wearing a tie. The house itself looks quite nice. He's sort of banging out a rhythm on the floor to accompany this older gentleman, who you'll notice is wearing, torn and threadbare clothing. So it seems like sort of a heartwarming scene on its surface, but I want to emphasize to you that the banjo for more than a century was an image that had been associated with African Americans in sort of a negative racial stereotype. So going back to the early 1800s, and all Black minstrel groups were oftentimes advertised as playing very specific instruments, the banjo included. It's sort of considered like this Pan-African instrument that kind of traveled across the Middle Passage to America in the memories of so many slaves. And then as the actual instrument was introduced in America, there are so many white people and sort of the racist belief that African Americans had sort of this natural talent that went along with the banjo, which would explain why they were so good at it, even though they thought less of African Americans in general. So that bled all the way into the 20th century, where you still had people minstrels performing, white men performing in blackface and performing with banjos. These stereotypes were reinforced throughout the 19th century, prints by Currier and Ives, like you can see here. So there are these strong associations with African Americans and banjos. The image that I have up here on the left was actually painted by a Black artist in the late 19th century, and it's called The Banjo Lesson, and it's one of the only images that really sort of pushes back on this stereotype of this natural ability with the banjo, because we see this kind of intergenerational sort of kind and sweet lesson that's taking place here. And so Norman Rockwell's image that he created early on in his career is really sort of playing with the same stereotypes that had been around for decades, if not centuries, that were really sort of harmful for the Black community. And his work otherwise, I should say, really fell in line with what the Saturday Evening Post was asking him to do, which was don't depict people of color unless they're in subservient roles. So the image on the left here is called He Went That Way from 1934. So we have this beautiful, elegant, slender white woman who has presumably fallen off her horse. And then to add insult to injury, it is a poor little Black boy who we see from behind who is telling her where the horse went. Over here on the right, we have an image that's called The Full Treatment from 1940. So we see this sort of plump middle-class man who's just delighted at the fact that he's getting this sort of spa day. And you can see that the figure kneeling on the left, who's shining his shoes, is a young Black boy. And if you look very closely, you can see that he has kind of holes on the bottoms of his shoes. Norman Rockwell, took pains to include him, but also to obscure him in so many ways. So Norman Rockwell's views quickly evolve, but it's not necessarily a straight shot in his career. And we'll talk about this image of these two boys in just a moment. But I wanted to share another quote from Rockwell that really, I think, underscores and illustrates where he's coming from on issues of race. He said, "I was born a white Protestant with some prejudices, which I am continuously trying to eradicate. I think that's a fantastic quote. And I think if he were alive today, Norman Rockwell would be called sort of an anti-racist. He was, he didn't proclaim himself to be, to not have a racist bone in his body, but he was really trying to do his best in terms of not being racist. And he went so far as to estrange himself from his own brother in order to accomplish that, because he did feel like his brother had opposing views there. So, so Norman Rockwell begins to seek out opportunities to paint more Black people and to tell their stories. And these paintings are not for the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, the next few that I wanted to show you, but I wanted to show you that he's interested. This is a painting from 1936. It was an illustration for a story in American Magazine. And I won't go into like all the details of the story, but essentially what we're supposed to see in this image is that a city girl has come to a country church. And the people in the country church are very interested in her, and they're all kind of checking her out. And we're supposed to be able to read sort of the differences in their clothes as being the big sort of separator and identifier here. And I have to say that this woman in the orange dress on the right, I mean, she's just a stunning beauty, I mean, she's one of the most beautiful women that Norman Rockwell has ever depicted. And so, I mean, he's going out of his way to find opportunities to paint pictures like this. He illustrated another story for American Magazine in 1940 called The Proud Possessor. That's what we see here. Just to quickly summarize it, it's a little white boy who wants to keep these dogs, and his parents don't want him to, so he convinces this little Black boy to take care of them. And the little Black boy says that he will, but he needs something in exchange to do that. So I think he asks for the white boy's watch. So this is the moment where they're kind of negotiating this. Now, if you know anything about Norman Rockwell, he's so wedded to realism that he always worked with models, and he always photographed models. He would take anywhere from 50 to 100 photographs in order to capture the exact pose that he wanted to convey in his paintings. So, so we can see here the models that he used and the poses. I mean, he has them standing up on these little pedestals here so he can get the exact perspective that he wanted, and then an early drawing over here on the left. And what's important to note here is that at this point in his career, Norman Rockwell has moved to Vermont, which at that point was the whitest state in the country. So being able to tell these stories and finding models who were Black or of any other ethnicity than white was a challenge for Rockwell, but it was something he was committed to. So with that, we're going to kind of circle back to the four freedoms and that depiction of the family celebration and the meal that we had seen earlier on. These are four posters that Norman Rockwell created, well, they're paintings that were turned into posters in 1943, inspired by the State of the Union address by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, which talked about these four inherent freedoms that all Americans are entitled to. And so from left to right, we have the freedom of speech. We have sort of a working class man who's standing up at a New England town hall meeting and voicing his opinion, even though you can see the people all around him are sort of more middle class. They're still yielding the floor to him and listening to differing ideas. We have the freedom of religion, where we have all of these heads and faces compressed into this tight space. Everybody's in a pose of prayer. We have freedom from want, where we have the celebration of this meal with this giant turkey. And then the freedom from fear over here on the right, where we have kind of the classic nuclear family. They're tucking in their babies at night and doing so without the fear of their own safety as they do this. So this was a real passion project for Norman Rockwell. He worked on it for 7 months. He lost 15 pounds in the process. And then the ultimate touring exhibition and the selling of these works, or copies of these works, raised $132 million for the war effort. So as you're looking at these works together, please note that the freedom from religion or freedom of religion is a very different image than the other three. The other three sort of are stories. There's characters. There's a storyline that's playing out. And the freedom of religion, again, is just all of these faces and heads. I will note that we have people of different races and different faiths coming together here. Norman Rockwell, it was very important for him to include people of different colors in this picture. And he thought that the Saturday Evening Post would publish it because it is about the freedom of religion. So he actually tried to tell the story of the freedom of religion. And this is sort of a working draft that he had of freedom of religion early on. And the concept here was that it would be all of these different people of different faiths gathering in a barber shop. And you'll notice here, so we've got, a priest right at the center, and I think this is supposed to be a Jewish man sitting in the barber's chair. But over here, right in the margin, there was an African-American man who was walking into the barbershop. Norman Rockwell eventually does away with this idea because he feels like it relies too heavily on stereotypes. And so ultimately he comes up with the final solution here for freedom of religion. And we can see that it is very different. It's still very compelling, and he still manages to get in people of different colors here. So staying with this time period with the World War II, in 1945, he does another incredible depiction of homecoming. We already saw one in today's program. Here we have the GI returning home after the war is done. We have the excitement of his family and even his entire neighborhood. The dog is like flying through the air. It's so excited to see this young GI who, again, we see from behind. We take on his perspective. His sweetheart is standing over here, ready to reunite too. Norman Rockwell actually went to like a tenement community. I believe it was in Troy, New York. And he documented what he saw there. And what he saw there were people of different races who were just, of the same social class and socializing. And so it was important for him to somehow get that on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post, even despite the Post's rule. So you can see up here, this detail here, some of the neighbor boys have climbed a tree, and we see that there is a little black boy who is at the top of that tree. And we can see that we've come a long way from J.C. Leyendecker just almost a decade before, where he's trying to sort of reinforce a social hierarchy, and Norman Rockwell's just trying to tell the story of a desegregated community, or at least, a hopeful note of a desegregated community. Now, we're going to take a quick pause here because something happens in Norman Rockwell's life that I think sort of impacts or shows his feelings about race in a really important way. And so what we're looking at here are two images of a woman named Crystal Malone, who is one of very few African-American students at the University of Vermont in 1946. And the picture that you see over here on the right was Crystal Malone was invited to join a sorority while she was at the University of Vermont. And the national organization of that sorority quickly tried to put an end to that. And the head of the sorority drove up from Washington, D.C. to Vermont and was trying to encourage all of these women to not allow a Black woman into the sorority. The sorority was really fighting to have Crystal included. They went to the university president. They asked for his support. Obviously, it became a national story. This was featured in Life magazine. And the president of the University of Vermont really didn't step up. And he began to receive mail from all over the country of people saying, you should really support these girls, including from Norman Rockwell. He actually put pen to paper, wrote to the president of the University of Vermont, supporting Crystal Malone and the desegregation of this sorority. Ultimately, the girls in the sorority burned their charter because Crystal Malone could not be included. And actually, it wasn't until 2008 that the national organization of that sorority apologized to Crystal Malone for the way that they treated her. But I think just the fact that Norman Rockwell felt compelled to write a letter about that subject, I think really shows where he stood in the 1940s. Right after the war ends, he is invited by the Saturday Evening Post to create a cover for the 4th of July issue. So it's like the maximum, most hyped up patriotic cover you could imagine. And they decided that it would feature the Statue of Liberty. And previously, the Statue of Liberty had always been depicted a certain way on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post. The full view of the statue with her arm raised above her head. Norman Rockwell was really sort of thinking, how can I do this differently? How can I tell a story about Americans with my depiction of the Statue of Liberty? So you can see in this early sketch here, he's included all these different figures sort of standing at the base, sort of admiring the statue from below. And then ultimately, he got in touch with the organization that maintains the statue and said, do you have any photographs of people cleaning it? And they said, well, we have photographs of people cleaning the torch. And so that's what Norman Rockwell decided to focus on. Imagine just saying, like, I'm not going to paint the Statue of Liberty. I'll paint a little bit of her head, but it's really the torch. If you think about it, the torch is liberty. The torch is lighting the way for other people. That's exactly what the nation felt like it had done by 1946. So he's showing us 5 workers here who are about 300 feet off the ground, cleaning the heavy leaded amber that is the torch here. And Norman Rockwell snuck in a Black man as one of those workers. And apparently nobody noticed. It certainly got by the rules of the Saturday Evening Post. This image, or the original painting was donated to the White House, and it was on view for a number of years before an art historian who was doing research on it noticed that there was a Black man in that picture, and then contacted the Norman Rockwell Museum to ask them a little bit more about it. Even the director of the museum at the time just said, what? There's not supposed to be a Black man in that picture. And so it became this kind of point of pride. And we realized in retrospect that Norman Rockwell was trying to say, all of these people that are supporting, that supported the war effort and that make America run every single day, they're not obviously just white middle-class Americans. So this picture took on new meaning, and even at the White House, they repositioned it so that it stood, or so that it was displayed just over the sculptural bust of Martin Luther King Jr. So it has a new meaning. So zooming along through the 1940s, we see Norman Rockwell, again, sort of taking on issues of race. And sometimes his images, even to me, are a little ambiguous. What we're looking at here is called Boy in a Dining Car from 1946. And so we have a young boy, it's another one of Norman Rockwell's sons who's posing here, selecting an item from the menu with his change purse in his hands. And then an older gentleman, a Black man, who is sort of gazing down at this little boy. And it's sort of hard to determine exactly what he might be thinking and feeling here. But certainly the role of a porter on a train, the Pullman porters in particular, it was a very important job in the African-American communities. It was credited with essentially creating a middle class for African-Americans at the time. But even though you could make great tips while you were on the train, you were sort of the lowest rung on the social ladder. You were taking commands from white children even. So you have somebody like J.C. Leyendecker depicting that very dynamic on the cover of the Saturday Evening Post back in the 30s. And then Norman Rockwell kind of handling it in a different way, maybe sort of suggesting more of a paternal feeling in terms of the dynamic between the boy and the man here. So one of the last images that Norman Rockwell created, actually, this is sort of a segue here. Okay, Norman Rockwell is ready to sort of take on a new stance and treat his material in a new way. And we'll be looking at this image a little bit more in depth in just 1 minute, the golden rule. But I wanted to say that by the early 1950s, it was 1953, that Norman Rockwell suddenly moves from Vermont to Stockbridge, Massachusetts. Most people kind of associate him with Stockbridge. There's that great painting right there, that long panoramic view. The reason he moved is because his wife was required psychiatric treatment that she was receiving there. Norman Rockwell was also depressed, and he began to see a counselor. And the reason that he was depressed is because he felt like he needed to do something that was important in terms of his work. And it really takes about another decade before he arrives there, but it's already sort of percolating in him in the early 1950s. A few more of his paintings from this time, you can see that he's still kind of sneaking in these African-American characters in the storytelling that he's doing. This picture is called Roadblock, where we can see this dog is stopped, not just the truck, but an entire neighborhood of people. Norman Rockwell had gone to this neighborhood in LA, and he knew that it was an integrated neighborhood, and it was important to him to have these children also represented in the scene here. So as the decade wore on, the relationship between Rockwell and the Post began to sort of chafe a little. They knew that he was sort of their prize pony and that he did not like this rule that they had imposed. So even by 1960, he is the subject of their stories. He's being referred to as America's best loved artist. So I think they sort of throw him a bone and they allow him to publish this image, which is the Golden Rule. This is 1961. And of course, it's people of all ages, races, religions, ethnicities coming together with the text here, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's so simple, it's so beautiful. And we know that Norman Rockwell, sought out all of these models, even though he was living in a pretty white and rural community at the time. And we look at it today and we think, well, there's nothing controversial about this, right? But at the time, there were still a lot of people in America that felt that you do unto others that look like you. And so this was sort of controversial in a certain way. Well, with that, Norman Rockwell was ready to leave the Post. And he said at the time, for 47 years, I portrayed the best of all possible worlds, grandfathers, puppy dogs, things like that. That kind of stuff is dead now, and I think it's about time. So what does he do right after that? He actually sends in $500 to the NAACP and becomes a lifetime member. He's charged up. And it's actually his counselor that he's working with on his depression and his desire to create something that's meaningful, who says, well, I have a colleague down in Louisiana who's working with a little girl named Ruby Bridges. And that's maybe a story that you might be interested in. And that is sort of the genesis of this incredible painting called The Problem We All Live With, which was painted in 1963 to 1964. This was for Look magazine, which is where Norman Rockwell did a lot of his work in the 1960s after he left the Saturday Evening Post. And now all of a sudden, Norman Rockwell has the freedom to tell these stories about what's happening in America, the civil rights movement, the stories of Black people that he was never really able to touch. So here we have this incredibly powerful story of this young girl who is integrating schools in Louisiana. We've probably all remembered the photographs of young Ruby Bridges. She was 6 years old, and she was escorted in and out of her school, where she was the only Black student. And she faced protesters every single day who were not just protesting her being at school, they were protesting her very existence. They even had a coffin with a baby in it. So we can't even imagine how brave this little girl was. The impact this had on her family. If I'm remembering correctly, her father lost his job. The grocery store stopped selling to her mother. Her grandparents were sharecroppers and were kicked off of their land. So Norman Rockwell had the opportunity to tell an important story. And what we know from some letters to the editor at Look magazine, that he made an incredible impact. I love this letter in particular. I've never written to a national figure before, nor do I intend to make a habit of it now. Allow me to say that I've never been so deeply moved by any picture as by your painting in the current issue of Look magazine. Thank you for showing this white Southerner how ridiculous he looks. The truth is pretty hard to take until we get it from Norman Rockwell. So let's talk about what he does here that's so powerful. He worked with three models in order to sort of synthesize the final result of the little girl that he painted. I love these photographs because you can see how he's resting their feet on boards in order to effectively show that she is marching forward, sort of striding forward with these US Marshals as escorts. Norman Rockwell knew that this picture would be not on the cover, but in the center of the magazine. So he knew that right down the middle, there would be a gutter. And so he was sort of playing with, do I put Ruby sort of to the back of this figure group or to the front? And I think the result that he landed on here is really powerful, because we have Ruby Bridges having just passed this tomato that has hit the wall, and we don't know how close that was to her. And of course, the red on the wall is suggesting violence. It's suggesting blood. We've got the epithets on the wall and KKK on the wall, and all of it is contrasted with the innocence of this child in this clean white dress, and then the strong but sort of headless forms of these US Marshals who are marching in formation. So this picture for the 50th anniversary of the integration of the schools in Louisiana was brought to the White House, and Barack Obama had it hung just outside of the Oval Office. And there's a great snippet of a video of him talking about this picture, because the woman who's standing next to him is Ruby Bridges. She's only 66 years old today. And he turns to her and he says, "I wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you being there and doing what you did." So it's just such an incredible story of her bravery. And I want to connect this back to Norman Rockwell's incredible ability to tell a story of loneliness or isolation. In fact, he goes well beyond that here. He tells a story of like a threatened existence. But in both of these images, we have sort of the central figure in kind of these cool colors, surrounded by these kind of warm colors. And it emphasizes that, that separation and that loneliness and that isolation. So Norman Rockwell is leveraging those skills that we saw that he had early on. He was really motivated to portray so many circumstances of racial injustice, and he was particularly moved by a story that he had read about in the paper of 3 civil rights workers in Mississippi who were murdered by a sheriff and essentially an angry mob. And this is on the right, an early study for that picture, where he actually depicts the sheriff and the mob, and then the final result on the left, where you can only see their shadows and the suggestion of that danger. And one figure who's been shot already, another figure who is bleeding, and then the third figure sort of staring down what we know is going to be a violent end. Here are photographs of Norman Rockwell and his models in the studio in order to get the photographs to paint this. You can even see Norman Rockwell wearing the white shirt here and smearing it with blood in order to capture the realism of that moment. So throughout the 1960s, he's looking for opportunities to portray as many different kinds of people and their plights as possible. This is 1965. This is Look magazine again. Sergeant Shriver writes a major article called "How Goes the War on Poverty?" And you can see it's illustrated by Norman Rockwell. And look at the variety and the diversity of the faces in the background. And then we get to this other iconic image from the 1960s, and that is the New Kids on the Block. This is from 1967. It's the New Kids in the Neighborhood, I should say. And it's this sort of universal experience of sort of confronting someone who's different from you and all of the questioning and anxiety that goes along with that. And Norman Rockwell has sort of arranged this with all these little bursts of yellow from his shirt to the car back here to the armchair in the foreground. A Black family has moved into what is presumably a predominantly white neighborhood. And the children have sort of come out of their houses and they're all kind of skeptically examining each other. Norman Rockwell has included elements here to kind of suggest that it could go badly. We've got a white cat versus a black dog over here, and we can imagine, fighting like cats and dogs. But he's also included the detail of the baseball gloves. And so we know that, within a few moments, these kids are probably going to be playing catch and connecting in a wonderful way. So here's a few images of Norman Rockwell accomplishing exactly, working with young models in order to capture those perfect poses of apprehension and curiosity that we see here. This image has been reinterpreted by present day artists, in this case in a mural in New Orleans, where we sort of see the opposite happening, where it's a white family coming into a Black neighborhood, and instead of baseball gloves, we see soccer balls. So it's a hopeful image, but I think it's also a very real image. And I say sort of a universal image again, because it gets back to this idea that we have all confronted, whether or not it was in racial terms, but we've all sort of been confronted with someone who seems so different. And we're so hesitant, we're so scared. And then we've all had the experience that it just works out fine. You can easily get beyond differences. And Norman Rockwell's telling us here that that's what can happen in America with race. And I love this photograph of him with this picture because he was 70 years old when he painted this. And I think he was getting radical for his age. So the last sort of important kind of political image that I wanted to show you is one from 1968. This is also in Look magazine, and it's called The Right to Know. And so this is, people think of Norman Rockwell as puppies and grandfathers, but nobody thinks of him painting a diverse array of Americans confronting their government. And that's exactly what this picture was supposed to be about. It was about the Vietnam War, but it was also about civil rights. And Norman Rockwell includes himself in this picture, confronting his own government. He puts himself with the hippies, I mean, he's getting radical in his old age. And I think this was one of the last covers that he painted before his death. This was a cover that he created for American Artist magazine. It was 1976. It was the bicentennial. And so he puts himself with the very human-scaled Liberty Bell. And it's sort of a perfect analogy for how he felt about America, because clearly he loved America, but he also saw the cracks in it. But sort of remained true despite that. So in the year before his death, he won that Presidential Medal of Freedom, or was given the Presidential Medal of Freedom from Gerald Ford. And then after his death in 78, the Saturday Evening Post comes back loving him for all that he was, despite that sort of tense relationship that they had. And then when we think of his legacy today, we have all of these artists that are going back to his work and reinterpreting it with a more diverse cast of characters and telling these sort of aspirational stories about who America is and who America wants to be by showing more Americans, a truer sense of who the American people are. And it's not just one artist doing this. This is another sort of take on the freedom from want over here. So I will wrap up with that, and just the idea that I think if Norman Rockwell were alive today, not only would he approve of these images, but he'd be painting images similar to them. I think this is really where his head and his heart really were. So I'll finish there, and if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm all ears.
Thanks, Paula. And thank you, Jane. Feel free, anyone, to chat, type in a message, or if you want to unmute yourself and chime in, that'd be great. And I neglected to say this earlier, but I did type it up. I want to thank our friends group and the Quincy Art Association and Quincy for Transformative Change. They are co-sponsors to this program, and we couldn't do it without them. So thank you very much for that. And let me see if you need a little time to think about any questions for Jane. Go ahead.
I know that was a lot of information. That was a fire hose of information, right?
Yeah. I was kind of curious, Jane, about he had some head-to-head, disagreement with the Saturday Evening Post.
Yeah.
But did he have any allies at that time, like other artists or other people who supported his view of race?
That is such an interesting question. Are you thinking allies specifically at the Post?
At the Post, or other artists who maybe had reached out to him and said, we're with you, kind of thing, or?
Oh, that is a fascinating question, and I don't have the answer to that. Now I have to go back and look, Eileen. That's very interesting.
Yeah, maybe something for add to the presentation. I was just curious,
And I mean, we don't often imagine that like older white men living in rural America have, these sort of liberal or progressive ideas, especially at that time. So it would be really interesting to know, like, who was he talking to, and like, how did these ideas really sort of form and sort of concretize in his life. So I think that would be really interesting to know. Yeah.
It's clear he was a progressive Christian, so he was kind of already in that scene. So
yeah,
interesting.
perhaps at his church, right? Yeah. Good question. All right. Well, I think that this is, I always think of this presentation and the information from it as such good information to sort of share as people are having, these very personal and very emotionally charged conversations about race today. And I think it's just so amazing to know that somebody who we just fundamentally associate with like the very identity of America could not only
America. I'd always associated him with white America.
Yeah, sure. Right. Could have this kind of evolution in his thinking, and it's great for us because I mean we can point to the evidence of it too, and I think it's just really uplifting to hear that somebody sort of comes around in a way that we would want them to, I appreciate all the nice comments in the chat. It's absolutely my pleasure to share all of this. I do a lot of programs like this. I have to say this one is very near and dear to my heart because of the subject matter, but I'm doing a program on Edward Hopper tomorrow night for the Maynard Public Library, if anybody's interested in that. And I have a calendar of free public programs on my website, which is
IamCulturallyCurious.com. Is that right?
That's right.
Right. Go check it out, guys.
So thank you, everybody, for spending your evening with me. And yes, I can type that in right there. And Facebook is also a good way to stay up to date with the free public programs.
Okay. Perfect. All right.
All right, and there is, just go to the calendar page of my website, and there's registration info right there for that too.
And if any of your friends had missed this program, we recorded it and we're gonna put it up on our YouTube for future viewing. If you wanna take a look at the photos again and the great presentation. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you, Jane. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much. I appreciate the opportunity. Have a
Okay,
great
great.
day, everyone.
Oh, wait, we had a question. I have read about Charles Schulz and his push to publish racial issues as well. Maybe an interesting comparison?
That would be a very interesting comparison.
Oh,
I'm going to have to read up on that one, but I wonder how their timelines align too. So that would be that's a great question. I'll have to do something on that.
yeah. And Kelly, did you want to say something? Or yes? Hello?
I can't, hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Oh, good, I'm sorry. It said I couldn't mute, so that's why. Yes, I put that in because I had read about his push to incorporate different racial characters in his popularity, and their time is about 20 years, I think, different. So since they're such popular artists, illustrators, and so on, I thought their artwork might be an interesting comparison. So I just thought I would throw it out there and just say thank you so much. And I hope I can jump on tomorrow night. That sounds wonderful as well.
Thank you so much, Kelly.
Thank you, the library, and thank you, Jane. We did also sit in on your Van Gogh talks last year before all this madness. So
In person.
yes, yes. So thank you so much. I love this. This was just what we need. So Eileen, let's keep it rocking.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Jane.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye. I'm tired of